Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. California is facing many challenges, not the least of which is the impact of climate change on a growing population. A recent report commissioned by Nexus, which is a non-partisan, independent non-partisan organization focused on innovation, using innovation for California's future, was done by the Pacific Institute, another nonprofit, and they took a look at the connection between energy and water, and they came up with some pretty surprising findings. Our guest is the founder of Nexus, Noel Perry. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you very much, Mark.
So listen, why don't you first describe this kind of nexus between water, energy, and climate change?
Sure. Well, if we went back maybe hundreds of years and we lived by a stream or a brook and we wanted some water, we'd get a pail and we'd transport it. There would be no greenhouse gas emissions from that. So the nexus of water, energy, and greenhouse gas emissions has to do with that intersection of the fact that if we're going to use water, we need to move it. And if we're going to move it, we need energy. And when we move water using energy, there's a fair chance, unless it's clean energy, it's going to make greenhouse gas emissions. So that's
people don't understand that there's a pretty big connection between water and energy. But let me ask you this. So let's put this in context. How much energy does it take to produce the water that California needs?
Amazingly, 20% of the energy that's used in California is used to transport and move water.
Well, that's an amazing number. So, it's ubiquitous in our lives. Water's, obviously a very important part of our lives. Let's talk about residential use for a second. How has that changed over time, and what are the energy implications?
Right. Well, it's very interesting to know that a study that was done of water between 2005 and 2015 showed that the amount of water used in California went down by 25%.
That is, I think that would probably surprise a lot of people, but it actually went down. Let's talk, about ag, another big water user. The Public Policy Institute of California has said that there are 9 million acres of farmland that are irrigated, representing roughly 80% of all the water used by homes and businesses in the state. How has ag's demand for water changed over time, and what are the implications there?
Well, just like on the residential urban side, interestingly enough, since 1980, the amount of water for ag has remained flat. And even though it's remained flat, we have produced some very amazing agricultural goods, specialty goods, but the amount of water has remained the same.
So in essence, the value that they're getting for the water, what they're selling their crops for, it's actually gone higher.
That's right.
Yeah, and then I think if you talk to most farmers, they'll tell you that they use all kinds of technology to limit their use of water, to be more efficient and effective in their use of water. But groundwater, that's an energy use, right? I mean, pumping the water out of the ground is going to take some energy.
Absolutely. And a little bit later in the show, we may talk a little bit further about some of the challenges for agriculture. And that's one, because wastewater, not wastewater, but groundwater, as the aquifers have dried up or gone lower, the pumps have had to work harder to go deeper. And
Right.
That's one of the big challenges for ag in California over the next 20 years.
Yeah. And so you note in your report, or Pacific Institute notes in their report, that it takes energy to create an adequate supply of water. And there's lots of things. We're talking about extraction. We're talking about wells, groundwater, right. Conveyance, I think canals, treatment for drinking water, and then distribution to both residents and farms. what uses the most energy in residential and what uses the most in ag?
Sure. So in residential, it's heating water. So that's the end use of water. But with agriculture, it's opposite. So with agriculture, you've got to extract it, whether that's groundwater or whether it's surface water, and then you have to convey it. But in the end, maybe the way you're going to distribute it is through irrigation. And that's much less energy intensive than it is on the energy side, on the residential side, because you have to heat the water. And that's one of the themes of the report, that if we can reduce emissions in California by moving towards using heat pumps in other ways instead of using natural gas.
Yeah. So up next, we're going to talk about the urban water use, residentials and commercial. What's the demand for water? How does it impact energy use? And how does all of that impact climate change? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. As our guest has mentioned, per capita urban or residential and commercial use of water has remarkably declined significantly in the last 20 years. In fact, from 2000 to 2015, it declined by 25%. We're talking with Noel Perry, who is with Next 10, about a recent report they commissioned with Pacific Institute analyzing how the state's demand for water will impact its demand for energy. So let's talk about urban water. When we talk about urban water, we're talking about everything from factories to residential use. You've analyzed 3 different scenarios in terms of changes of urban water demand. What are they, and what factors are most likely to drive the demand for urban water?
Sure. So what we assumed here is different levels of demand. So there was 3 different scenarios. The first scenario is a high case scenario where per capita demand goes up, where we have an increase in recycling, where we have an increase in desalinization, along with increases in population. The mid case is one where it's the status quo, where it's the same level of demand. And the one that's most interesting, and the one that we're most hopeful for as we move between now and 2035, is the low case. And the low case assumes a decrease in per capita demand, along with, most importantly, energy conservation, along with water conservation.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's talk about the supply of water for urban users. Where is it most likely to come from?
Sure. Well, the water will continue to come from surface water and groundwater, primarily from surface water. And what is surface water? Surface water is water, fresh water that comes from the mountains, from streams, from lakes, from the Sierras. So that is the primary source of water for urban usage. But we also have water that comes from groundwater that we pump up that is mostly used for farms.
And that, of course, it varies depending on what hydraulic region you're in, where you're getting the water from. It's interesting they say that the water, the supply is in the north, but the demand is in the south. That's always been California's issue, because of ag land in the valley and then the population in Southern California. So how the different water scenarios for urban users impact the need for energy over time?
Sure. That's a really interesting question, and that kind of goes to the heart of the report. And we're looking at a couple of different scenarios here. One scenario is where there's a very significant increase in demand for water, and another where there's less of a demand for water. And I want to kind of look at my notes quick here, Mark, because I want to get this right. But if in fact the bad scenario, which is a very larger increase in the need for water, what will happen is that water demand might go up by 24% by 2035. We would also have a result of a 21% increase in electricity usage, along with a 25% increase in natural gas. However, on the positive side, if the state does significant conservation and efficiency. Electricity usage will go down 19%, emissions will go down 41%, and natural gas will go down 16%.
Well, that's pretty significant. By the way, sources of urban water, which one uses the most energy in terms of sources?
Yeah, in terms of sources, by essentially the water that we use to heat residentially, that uses the most amount of energy. We also have desalination and recycling, which also uses a lot of water.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking in your report, you indicate that residential heating is a major consumer of energy. So if that's true, if we convert from natural gas to electric water heaters for urban use, what impact is that going to have? And what impact is that going to have on energy demand? And what impact is that going to have ultimately on greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure, it is going to have a very significant positive impact by reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And what we're talking about here is that most houses in California are for our domestic water use, to have hot water and to have hot water to wash dishes, and also to do our heating. We have natural gas. We use natural gas, and that creates greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, if we use a heat pump and heat our water that way, it's more efficient. And we're using whatever the combination is for the utility that we have. So, for example, for PG&E, there's a lot of renewables, so it's going to be cleaner energy.
Let me ask you this. In terms of tankless hot water heaters, does that make any difference? Or is that what you're talking when you talk about electric?
Yeah, we're talking about two systems. You have tankless, where it's kind of hot water on demand, and those are very efficient. And then the other ways of heating water for houses are these heat pumps that you can put inside or outside, and they use electricity.
Okay, very good. Well, up next, we're going to talk about ag's water use and what impact it has on energy. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Noel Perry with Next 10 that commissioned a report recently with the Pacific Institute on the future of California's water, energy, and climate nexus. In short, how do we deliver water in a way that will be most efficiently and effectively has less of an impact on greenhouse gases, in essence? So let's talk a little about ag and the use of water, their use of water. Your report focused specifically on the energy required to supply the Central Valley's ag water needs, and that represents about 80% of the state's total ag water use. In your analysis, like your analysis with urban water users, you ran it on 3 different scenarios: high, medium, low, in essence. What did you find?
Sure. In all 3 scenarios, there was a reduction in the amount of water, and that reduction was between 2 and 5%. And this was estimated between 2015 and 2035. And one of the most important issues with regard to agricultural water is groundwater and how much that water is pumped out of the aquifer. And as the water in the aquifers go lower and the pumps have to go deeper to find that water, that is a challenge.
And you also think about SGMA, which is the state requirement that by 2040, that groundwater, that they even out the taking and the supply and demand. That's also going to have another effect on ag in a big way, obviously. So, when we come to water, and we're looking at the supply of water for Central Valley's ag needs. Where is that supply likely to come from? And will that demand be increasing, decreasing, or remain the same over time?
Sure. Like urban water, most of the water is going to come from surface water and also groundwater. And there probably will be less water over time. I think we all know about the significant drought that we're experiencing here in California. But that is a challenge, and that is what the assumptions are going to be, that there will be less water and that there'll be less deliveries.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that in terms of the deliveries from the canals, you're expecting it's not going to increase. It's probably going to go down.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How big of an impact will these predicted declines in water, ag water use have on energy usage?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the declines will be between 2 and 5%, and there'll be a similar impact for energy usage and also for greenhouse gas emissions. And so that is something that will absolutely be positive as we look to the future, with the caveat that I just mentioned about groundwater and whether or not the pumps are going to go deeper into the aquifers to take water out, because that will absolutely increase the amount of energy usage and the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, it seems, over the last certainly 20, 30 years, I mean, they just keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper wells. And obviously it takes a lot of energy to pump all that water out. And then they have to irrigate their crops. They use a lot of water. The other issue that's going on with ag is, replacing seasonal crops or annual crops with trees that have to be watered all the time. And so whether you have a drought or not, they've got to be watered. That has another impact on groundwater and all the rest of it. So can one assume that there's going to be a decline in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the use of water by Central Valley agriculture going to 2035?
I think that we can make that assumption because, as we mentioned, the researchers found that there'll be a 2 to 5% reduction in the amount of water used for ag. And at the same time, there'll be a reduction in terms of the energy usage. And with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, we will see some reductions there. Again, with the caveat being, what are we going to do with groundwater and how deep are we going to go?
Yeah, I think one of the things, though, that people are probably saying, well, wait a second, what about diesel pumps? Don't they emit greenhouse gases? And I think one of the things you noted in your report that you didn't include diesel pumps in this situation because they're very small, becoming a very, very small part of the pumps in ag for water. Increasingly, the state has moved toward, and farmers have moved toward, electrification of those groundwater pumps. So up next, we're going to take a look at some of your policy recommendations to deal with water and energy use in California going forward. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Noel Perry with Next 10, an independent, nonpartisan organization focused on harnessing innovation to improve California's future. They commissioned a report recently with the Pacific Institute about this intersection between energy use and water use. So I want to ask you about your analysis on urban water users. What steps need to be taken in your mind to reduce the amount of energy and therefore greenhouse gas emitted through the use of urban water use?
A first step, which is simple but also profound, has to do with water conservation and actually using less water. Combined with that is energy efficiencies in the house, for example, and in particular having to do with how we heat water. We heat water in the home for domestic use and also for heating. And if we can move off of natural gas and move towards using heat pumps, so that we use a source of clean energy, that will be very important.
It seems, you talk a lot about energy. One of the things that people are saying is that we're going to oversubscribe, electric energy, electric cars, electric pumps. So that's an issue. And some people do talk about, natural gas as a transition fuel going forward. So that's another separate issue. But let me ask you this. What's often overlooked in this whole process is treating water. So what can be done to reduce the amount of energy and therefore greenhouse gases associated with treating water?
Sure. Treating water is really important because, as many people know, we have to treat the water before we send it to your houses for you to be able to drink it. And one of the ways in which we can reduce the usage of energy and also the greenhouse gas emissions is to use demand response. And what that means specifically is that for a treatment center that is treating water, to use water and make their machines and pumps work at certain times of the day when there's clean energy available and they can get lower rates, that will be very significant in terms of making a difference in terms of treatment centers and reducing emissions.
It seems like they would be doing that anyway. It seems just logical that they would be doing it off peak. But good suggestion. Let's turn our attention to Central Valley Ag and their water needs. What can be done to reduce the amount of energy needed for Valley agriculture to get its water needs met?
Sure. Again, going back to groundwater, one of the most important things is that when the pumps are used to pump water from aquifers, that the rules are followed in terms of how much and how deep they pump, because the more they pump, the deeper they go, the more energy usage there's going to be and the greater greenhouse gas emissions there will be.
You know, I'm looking at your report, and one of the things that kind of stands out is this, and you've repeated several times about the need for good information. And you know, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. You know, is the state or whoever collecting the right information so we can really analyze this problem? So what is your concern about the data that's being collected in this area?
I think there can be improvements, and as we move towards 2035 into the future, it's going to be really, really important that the water managers across the state, both at the state level and the local level, have the right amount of data and information to make smart decisions that can reduce the amount of energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that means the energy regulatory people talking with the water regulatory people, so that we can get the right decisions here to reduce the amount of water that's used and the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, everybody's got to be talking, you know, singing from the same hymnal, or at least speaking the same language, for sure.
Exactly.
Before we get to the bottom line, I wanted to ask you, you did mention that you commissioned the Pacific Institute to do this report. Why the Pacific Institute?
The Pacific Institute, because they have a really, really wonderful reputation in the state of California doing water research. They've been doing it for over 20 years. They do research not only in California, but across the country. And it really is an honor for us to work with the Pacific Institute to do this report. And it's something that we wanted to do for a number of years.
You know, the other thing is, you know, we're talking about this whole nexus between water and energy. A lot of people, frankly, it's just something they don't think about, right? You turn on the tap, water comes out. You see the trees that the farmers are growing, you just assume the water is going to get there somehow. And you're now talked about this, but I'm wondering, you know, the state's done a lot of work on, you know, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Have they been factoring this whole water energy nexus connection into that analysis?
I think they have. And going back to the top, we know that 20% of the energy that's used in California is used to move, transport, and treat water. So water is a very important part of the climate goals for California in terms of looking at reducing emissions. And the state of California, the California Air Resources Board, is very aware and working to improve the reductions in emissions from the water sector in California.
We've only got about 15 seconds left. So what's the bottom line?
The bottom line is that we need to conserve water and we need to be more efficient in how we use it.
That's a great summary. I want to thank our guest, F. Noel Perry with Next 10 for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can look on our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.